What's up guys, hope you're having a good day. In this video we're going to be breaking down all of the main card fights taking place this weekend at UFC Fight Night Moreno versus Royval. We're going to be taking a deep dive into these fights from a betting perspective. Hopefully you're going to be able to use the information in this video to make better betting decisions, maybe even earn some extra cash. And if you'd like to watch breakdown videos, my analysis for all the other fights on this card, all of the prelim fights, head on over to my website MMABettingTips.com, where on there I post all my bets for every event, as well as breakdown videos for every single fight on every single UFC card. The reason why I don't put them out on YouTube is because obviously it takes a long time to even work through these main card fights. So if I were to do the prelims as well, these videos would end up being 3-4 hours long. And also, if you research an event properly, put the level of depth into the research that you really need to fully understand these fights. It takes a very long time to research a UFC card properly, so a lot of the time I'm still researching fights into like Friday night, Saturday morning, when that's very close to the time that these events are scheduled to take place. So it would just delay the process of uploading these videos on content if I didn't put videos out until I'd had a chance to research the whole card. Not throwing shade at anyone else on YouTube that does get videos out super early. I just personally don't understand how they're able to research fights properly and get content out so quickly. Maybe I'm just slow, maybe I'm just stupid. Anyway, we're going to kick things off by talking about the main event on this weekend's card, which is going to be Brandon Moreno versus Brandon Royval. A rematch from a fight that ended prematurely all the way back in 2020 when Brandon Royval dislocated his shoulder. And even though the fight wasn't going particularly well for him, obviously the fact that the fight ended in round 1 doesn't tell us a whole lot about how Moreno and Royval measure up against one another this weekend, because their first fight ended very quickly, and also Royval has improved a lot since the first time they fought back in 2020. On top of that, I don't want to necessarily say that Brandon Moreno has declined since 2020, but he's certainly not. I feel that he's plateaued at the very least. I don't see any improvement in Moreno, and his fight IQ for me has become a real issue. I know that he's gone back to train full time in Mexico, and I do feel this has had a bit of a negative impact on his career, because he's certainly not as good as he was 3 or 4 years ago, which is strange because at 30 years old he's in his prime, and you'd expect him to be getting better and better from fight to fight, but I actually see Moreno heading in the other direction, which is a little bit unfortunate. Does also make him a bit of an outlier because, like I say, you wouldn't expect a former UFC champion to be getting worse at this stage in his career. From what I've seen in Moreno's fights from the last 2-3 years, he is, unfortunately. Now, I don't know if that's going to change the outcome of this rematch. I don't think Moreno's declined to the point where Royval is going to be able to win this. But it does make me a little bit more nervous for Moreno, because I think if he doesn't utilise certain strategies and game plans in this matchup, there are opportunities for Royval to cause him problems here. And we'll dig into what those game plans and strategies are going to be as we talk through this fight. So we can see that Moreno is a pretty big favourite, which you'd expect him to be. He is around about a 1.34 favourite, which is going to be minus 294 for an implied probability of 75%. If we take a look at the odds on Royval, he's around an average of 3.30, which is going to be plus 230 for an implied probability of 30%. So obviously it's a very steep price to pay on Moreno, and his odds have been steadily declining this week. When I first researched the fight on Monday, I think he was around about a 1.40 minus 250 favourite. Yeah, he was. And then in the last few days, his odds have started to tank. But this is nothing really too surprising for me. People love the gamble, and it's a main event fight. Royval looked pretty awful in his last fight against Pantoja. Moreno's a former champion. He's got home advantage on his side. He's a popular fighter, fan favourite. So I'm not surprised to see his odds decline. But again, I would question anyone betting Moreno at an implied probability of 71%, because Royval has proven he's dangerous. For all of his weaknesses, he's got tons of weaknesses. I would still question where the value is on Moreno in this odds range, and certainly in this odds range, I mean, you'd have to be capping Moreno at like 80% to get any value here, which is kind of crazy to me, even though I do heavily favour him. So Moreno is 30 years old, 5'7", with a 70-inch reach. Royval, 31 years old, 5'9", with a 70.5-inch reach. So we can see that both guys roughly the same age, roughly the same size. Royval has that long, lean, skinny body type. Moreno a little bit smaller, more compact. Royval's doing a much better job of using his length these days. We've spoken about Royval being a guy that improves or is improving, and his improved ability to use his length is definitely one of the major ways in which he's improving. We'll get into a bit more on that in a second. Let's first of all finish talking about X factors on this matchup. Now, there's a couple of big X factors on this card. We can see that the event is taking place in Mexico City, so obviously all of the Mexican fighters who are competing against non-Mexicans are going to have a pretty big advantage on this card. We know that Mexicans, when they fight non-Mexicans in Mexico, win around 65% of the time. Now, obviously, favourable matchmaking for hometown fighters will contribute to that statistic, but at the same time, you know, the fans in Mexico are crazy. They're going to get behind their hometown fighters, and so we know that's going to have a big impact on the probabilities of Mexican fighters winning this weekend. But another big X factor that will come with the event this weekend taking place at Mexico City is that this event is taking place at high altitude. And whenever we see fight cards at high altitude, we see big impacts on fighter cardio. And some fighters respond better to the high altitude climate than others. But what I would say is, it doesn't really matter who you are. There's no way to really eliminate the impact that high altitude will have on your performance. Basically, everyone is going to look worse this weekend. It doesn't matter if you're Mexican, it doesn't matter if you're Swedish, it doesn't matter where you train, it doesn't matter where you live. Even if you live and train in Mexico City, it is still harder to fight in Mexico City than it is in New York at sea level. So high altitude impacts every fighter, and while we don't know exactly to what extent it will impact them, what we can do is look at where they live, look at where they train, look at if they've done anything to climatize and prepare for the altitude. And what we can also do is look at the individual styles and types of fighters we're dealing with on this card to give us some indication of how much the altitude is likely to affect them. So as we go through this card, that's really what I'm going to be talking about with each individual guy. So let's get into how these two match up stylistically and how I think that altitude is going to impact this matchup. To be honest, this is one of the very few fights on the card where I don't think the altitude is really going to have any impact at all. We've seen Brandon Moreno fight in Mexico before. He's been fine. And Royval's a cardio machine. So both these guys have got never-ending, non-stop genetic cardio. To be honest, cardio is like the biggest strength for both these guys. So I don't think cardio is going to have an impact on these guys performing at all. I think they'll be fine. But it can't be said about other fighters on this card. Okay, so in terms of how these two match up from a stylistic point of view, so in my opinion, Brandon Moreno is significantly better than Royval in every single aspect of MMA, apart from pure Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. But since it's not a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu match, it probably isn't going to matter. And we've seen Royval's biggest weakness throughout his career is that because he's got a base in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, he gives up cheap takedowns, and he doesn't really try to stuff takedowns because he wants to be on his back hunting for like long shot triangles and armbar attempts. And if you put him on his back, he's very easy to hold down because he doesn't really make much of an effort to get back up to his feet. So even though Royval's got a very tricky submission game and he's crafty on the ground, and this could potentially cause Moreno some problems because we saw Moreno get caught in some bad positions in the Pantoja fight, which cost him. Ultimately, Moreno has the edge when it comes to grappling in this fight, because Moreno has a far better understanding of position over submission. We know 9 times out of 10 in MMA, the fighter in top position is the fighter winning. And the problem with Royval is that he always wants to be on the bottom. And so Moreno, whenever we see Moreno grapple, even in the Pantoja fight, he does work hard to be in top position and stay in top position, which gives him an edge in this matchup. Now, the Pantoja versus Moreno fight, where Moreno lost the title, it's kind of a crazy fight because, for the most part, outside of Moreno getting dropped in round 1, he basically won the entire fight. Like, he basically controlled the entire fight. He outstruck and outgrappled Pantoja for the majority of the remainder of the fight. What cost Moreno is that he got complacent or overly aggressive on 2 or 3 occasions going from the beginning of round 2 to the end of the fight. And because Pantoja's such a high-level Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioner, he was able to make Moreno pay for those moments of complacency, obtain back control, and steal rounds with back control. And when Pantoja was able to lock up that body triangle and take Moreno's back, there's nothing Moreno could do about it. Pantoja was able to rack up long periods of grappling control. Now, it's not impossible Royval could do this as well. The issue that Royval's got is that he doesn't really have the wrestling of Pantoja to get into positions where he can make Moreno have to give up his back or expose his back, where the back takes can then come from. Pantoja, with his wrestling, was able to create scrambles and situations where he was able to take Moreno's back. Royval isn't as capable of doing that. But the reason why Royval could potentially put Moreno in some bad positions on the ground is that his cardio is excellent and he does work very hard on the ground. He's very crafty. Pantoja is one of these guys whose cardio is terrible. Even if you go watch the most recent title fight against Brandon Moreno, round 2, Pantoja was gassed pretty bad, breathing very heavily. He was struggling. He just managed to dog it out and find ways to steal 2 of the rounds after round 1, which enabled him to win a decision. However, he looked pretty terrible in that fight because of how tired he was. Royval's the kind of guy that can go hard for 5 rounds and not slow down and still remain scrambly, still remain tricky on the ground. So if a tired Pantoja was able to obtain back control on Moreno, kind of causing him some problems on the ground, then Royval can as well. Now, I don't think it's particularly likely. I think Moreno's probably going to be able to neutralise the threat of Royval's grappling quite easily and just kind of big brother him on the ground by being the stronger fighter who is much more aware of position. But when we're dealing with implied probabilities in this odds range, it's really important that if you bet a guy in this odds range, there's really no significant risk factors. And I feel with how easily Pantoja was able to kind of trap Moreno in certain positions, the threat of Royval's ground game is a big enough risk factor that would make it difficult to cap, Moreno in that 80% implied probability range, which is where you'd need to cap him in order to get value at these odds. So even though it's improbable that Royval causes him problems on the ground, it's not impossible. And I would want it to be close to impossible in order to even consider Moreno in this odds range. So that's how they kind of match up on the ground. What's interesting about this fight is, obviously, Royval on the feet is very bad defensively, and Moreno has a big advantage when it comes to striking. Moreno's primarily a striker. Gone blurry, do apologise. But yeah, Moreno's got good boxing, fights at a high pace, and is the more skilled striker out of the two. I will say that Royval is starting to use his length a lot better, and he's starting to do a much better job of chipping away at his opponents with like long kicks, range-finding punches. What is another issue that I've seen in Moreno over the last 2-3 years, and a big part of why I think he's definitely plateaued, possibly even declining, is that Moreno's fight IQ is very bad at this stage in his career. So I think Moreno, against guys like Figueiredo, against guys like Pantoja, have been very guilty of headhunting a little. So if you go back sort of 3-4 years in Moreno's career, his striking was so good because he would just focus on volume, and because he's tough, and because he's very technical, and because he throws a very diverse range of strikes, he would be able to rack up a huge amount of jabs and leg kicks, which would set up his power strikes, and he would just like kind of overwhelm guys with volume. And then somewhere along the line, he became like overly tactical and overly strategic, where he would start trying to pick his shots and set things up and look for the kill shot to knock guys out. And in the process, his volume style of striking kind of went away, which then in turn made him a lot less effective than he used to be. So Moreno does have to be a little bit careful on the feet here, not to allow Royval to make these rounds closer than they need to be on the feet. Because I could see a situation where Royval is kind of dancing around Moreno with a lot of footwork and movement, chipping away at Moreno from behind the jab and with leg kicks, and the rounds end up being visually close because Moreno is trying to stick a move and land a perfect shot, and in the process he's kind of getting outworked. Moreno needs to be really careful of that because we know how bad judging is in the UFC, and while it is extremely unlikely that Royval would be able to win a decision against Moreno in Mexico with hometown judging on Moreno's side, when we look at the Canadian card last month, a lot of Canadians lost a lot of really bad decisions actually, despite having home advantage. Brad Katona lost a dubious decision. Sergey Siddy lost a dubious decision. I think there were some others on the card as well. So again, that's a cautionary tale that betting guys in this odds range can be very dangerous. But what is the most likely way in which this plays out? Well, the most likely way in which this plays out is that Moreno exercises his advantages on the feet, is the superior striker, lands the harder, more impactful shots and outstrikes Royval. And if they do get into any grappling positions, because Moreno's much more aware of position over submission, should be able to kind of out-wrestle Royval, take top position and beat him up from top position in a similar way really to what Alexandre Pantoja did, and to some extent what Rogerio Bontorin did for decent portions of that fight as well. So it's a good fight for Moreno. His odds reflect that, which make this dead for betting. I certainly wouldn't be betting on Royval to win this against a popular Mexican in Mexico that is better than him everywhere, but I don't see any upside in Moreno at these odds either. Pretty dead fight for betting. If we look at the over-under on this matchup, we can see that it is set at over 3.5 rounds. I do think this fight is very likely to go deep. Both guys are very, very tough. If we look at their records, Moreno frequently goes deep in fights. If you look at Royval, a lot of his fights end quickly, but it tends to be, catching guys with like flash KOs or long shot submissions, which aren't going to be easy to hit on a guy like Moreno. As soon as he faces a step up in competition, you can see the fight kind of cruised to a decision against Pantoja and didn't really come close to being stopped. So with how these two match up stylistically, even though Royval's dangerous, I think both guys are super tough and not like crazy dangerous in the context of how they match up against one another. Sometimes, a guy's not crazy dangerous like Royval, but he still has a good chance of maybe finishing his opponent if their submission defense isn't great. But with a guy like Moreno, it's really going to be difficult to submit him. In fact, I doubt Moreno's been submitted many times in his career. If we look at his record, sorry about this, guys. If we look at his record, he's only been submitted one time on The Ultimate Fighter against Alexandre Pantoja. So that says it all, basically. So yeah, I think the fight is more likely to go to a decision. I don't like the idea of betting fights to go to a decision in 5-round, 25-minute fights, because 25 minutes is a really, really long time in a cage fight to the death for someone not to get hurt very, very badly and finished. So I'm not going to be betting that myself, but I do think this fight is quite likely to go to a decision. So if you do want to bet the over-under on this fight, I would take the the over fight to go to a decision. Maybe even over 3.5 rounds. In actual fact, over 3.5 rounds is a little bit interesting to me. Again, I don't think you're getting a great risk to reward ratio, but that's quite likely to hit. In terms of the prop bets, I think the most likely outcome is Moreno by decision. I wouldn't be interested in any other prop, but the odds are terrible. So if you want to sprinkle a little bit of money on this fight to make watching it more interesting, maybe Moreno by decision is your bet. It's not for me. I won't be betting it, but I do think that is the most likely prop to hit. So I hope you found that useful. So now let's break down the co-main event on this card, which really is kind of like the main event. Everyone's very excited for this fight. It's a great stylistic matchup. It's going to be interesting to see how Brian Ortega looks on his return, and it's a super interesting stylistic matchup. So if we take a look at the odds on this one, we can see that Yair Rodriguez is the favourite at average odds of around. There's quite a big odds spread on this, and we are starting to see some odds movement as Ortega's odds start to decline. So we will say average odds of around, say, call it 1.65 on Yair, which is minus 154 for an implied probability of 61%. We take a look at the odds on Brian Ortega. The odds are around 2.30, which is going to be plus 130 for an implied probability of 43%. So I'm almost 40 years old. I'm an old man. I'm a dinosaur. I've watched thousands of hours of UFC. I watch a lot of UFC every week with my research process. I've been making money betting on the UFC for 15 years. I'll probably be betting the UFC and making money on the UFC for the next 15 years, right? Made a profit pretty much every year over the last 15 years, and probably going to be continuing to do that for another 15 years. So I feel at this point I've seen a lot of shit and I've learned a lot of shit. And what I can tell you about this fight is, if you like money, don't bet this fight, because there is absolutely no way for you to know who's going to win with any degree of confidence at all. And anyone that talks confidently about this fight is kidding themselves, or they haven't researched it properly. This is one of those fights that pops up every once in a while where it's absolutely impossible to try and make an accurate prediction on how this one's going to play out, because both guys have such extreme advantages in the area that the other is weak, that either one of these guys could totally destroy the other any moment in time, and it's completely impossible to predict who is more likely to do that because of how vulnerable both guys are in their area of weakness. So it's a classic striker versus grappler matchup. Ortega has a huge advantage if this fight goes to the ground. Rodriguez has a huge advantage if this fight stays standing. And because of how bad Rodriguez's takedown defense is, but because of how bad Ortega's wrestling is, there's no way to know if this is going to be a stand-up fight or not. And I will show you footage throughout this breakdown which will explain why, if you are going to bet this fight this weekend, you are totally gambling. If you bet Ortega this weekend and he wins, you might think you're really smart, genius, you called it, all that sort of stuff. You didn't really, you got lucky. Same with if you bet Yair Rodriguez this weekend and he knocks Ortega out in 2 minutes. You might think you're really smart and you predicted this fight correctly, but you didn't, you got lucky. It's no different to going and playing roulette and putting $100 on a red number, spinning the wheel, and the ball landing on a red number. You didn't predict that the number would come out red. That's just what happened in the universe that night. You didn't predict it. That's just where the ball landed. And that's pretty much how I feel about a fight like this. And I will show you footage to explain why. So if we kick things off by looking at the tail of the tape. Ortega's 33 years old, 5'8", with a 69-inch reach. Rodriguez, 31 years old, 5'11", with a 71-inch reach. So both guys roughly the same age, roughly the same size. Rodriguez a little bit longer and taller than Ortega. I don't think it matters a whole lot in the context of this matchup, because, I mean, Ortega is going to be a sitting duck on the feet anyway, and Rodriguez is going to be able to light him up easily. So I don't think it matters what kind of reach advantage Rodriguez has got. Ortega is in a world of trouble if this fight stays standing. Rodriguez's advantages on the feet are utterly enormous. So the only other X factor to really discuss on this one is the fact that we haven't seen Ortega for a long time. It's been out since July 2022, so he's got ring rust, all that kind of stuff to deal with. He obviously suffered a pretty significant shoulder injury in the last Yair Rodriguez fight as well, and we know that shoulder injuries, like dislocated shoulders, things like that, torn muscles, all kinds of things like that in the shoulder, they're one of those things that sometimes never heal, like a broken hand. Once you injure them once, they are the kind of injury that can become a recurring injury and crop up again in future fights. I mean, we saw it happen with Brandon Royval, right? The first time he fought Brandon Moreno, dislocated his shoulder, and that was a recurring injury that Royval had suffered with in training in the past. And we even saw it happen to TJ Dillashaw against Aljamain Sterling, where he said, he dislocated his shoulder a number of times in the year or two leading up to that fight. So now that Ortega's got that shoulder injury, maybe it's fully healed, maybe it isn't, we don't know, but it's certainly an additional risk factor to betting Ortega this weekend, because with him being a grappler, he's going to have to use his shoulders a lot, right, to put a lot of stress and pressure on them when working for takedowns, submissions, that sort of thing. So it's a risk factor, man. It's not good. The other X factor that we need to discuss in this fight is altitude. And we know that altitude is going to have a different impact on every single fight on this card in different ways. Just, why is this blurry? Blurry, very annoying. Sorry, guys. There we go. Sharpened it up. We know that the altitude is going to have a different impact on every fight. Now, what's really, really, really interesting about this one is Ortega obviously lives and trains in California. Rodriguez is Mexican, has trained in Mexico a lot throughout his career, and has fought multiple times in Mexico City throughout his career. So Rodriguez will be very used to high altitude. Won't be anything new to him. He's got experience dealing with the high altitude of Mexico City. But the paradoxical conundrum of this fight, the crazy aspect of this fight, which feels crazy me even saying this, but I think even though Rodriguez is Mexican, has a lot of experience training, living, fighting in Mexico, I think the altitude is likely to have a far bigger negative impact on Yair Rodriguez than it is on Brian Ortega. Now, I could be completely wrong, but Ortega's one of these guys that has built a career off having excellent cardio. I don't think I've ever seen him breathing heavily, other than in fights where his face has been crushed and obviously his nose is bust up and he's taken a lot of damage. But from a pure cardio point of view, Ortega is a cardio machine. One of these guys that can fight at a relentless pace and not get tired. Ortega's cardio and toughness are one of his biggest strengths. And so it's possible altitude could hit him really hard and destroy him. We saw this happen to Cain Velasquez, who was a cardio machine, and then the first time he fought at Mexico City, the altitude destroyed him. That might happen to Ortega, but the thing is, guys like Ortega that have got genetically good cardio just seem to deal much better at high altitude than guys that don't. And the thing about Yair Rodriguez is, even at sea level, he does slow down a lot as fights wear on. So when we look at Rodriguez in round one, he's light on his feet, generates a lot of pop on his shots, a lot of impactfulness in his kicks, and he's really fast and sharp and dynamic. And then with every round that progresses, Rodriguez gets sloppier, more tired, more flat-footed, easier to take down. And so, for me, I think the altitude is likely to have a far bigger impact on Rodriguez. I know a lot of people will disagree with me. Let me know what you think on Discord. Let me know what you think in the comments. But, I think Ortega is going to deal better with the altitude this weekend. The only other X factor to consider, and this is going to be a talking point that we are going to be discussing a lot over the next 12 to 18 months, is that Ortega obviously did previously fail a drugs test. He was a very, very naughty boy. He got caught taking performance-enhancing drugs and, served his suspension. It's all good. Everyone makes mistakes. But what is very interesting about this fight is that obviously USADA are no longer in the UFC. The UFC have said that there's a really great drug testing protocol in place that is used by the NBA and the WWE, which I find is hilarious because clearly all the athletes in the WWE are super clean. So that's quite funny that they claim that the integrity of the sport when it comes to performance enhancing drug testing is in a really high standard of testing. Sounds like a little bit of questionable truths, shall we say? But what do I know? I'm just an idiot on the internet. Anyway, I just think it's a little bit interesting that Ortega's previously been caught using a performance-enhancing drug, cleaned things up through USADA, and now he's coming in on a pretty long layoff when USADA aren't in the picture anymore. So, will Ortega potentially be back on the juice this weekend? Who knows? I certainly don't. But I do think over the last sort of 6 months, we've seen a big shake-up in the UFC, where a lot of unpredictable things have happened. A lot of fighters have made exponential improvements, and I think we'll continue to see that over the next 12 to 18 months. And so previous performance-enhancing drug users like Ortega, we should keep an eye on them, because now without USADA on the scene, we could start to see him look a hell of a lot better than he did the last time we saw him. So that's just a bit of a risk factor to betting on Yair this weekend. So in terms of how these two match up from a stylistic point of view, classic striker versus grappler matchup. Obviously, Rodriguez, huge advantage on the feet. Ortega, huge advantage on the ground. And this fight's really going to come down to whether or not Ortega can get the fight to the ground, keep the fight on the ground, and basically whether or not Ortega chooses to grapple, because we've seen so many performances from Ortega over the years where he kind of zombies forward, just plods around the octagon, blocking punches with his face, getting lit up, taking loads of damage, without actually trying to get fights to the ground that hard. And he's a frustrating guy to watch because we know he's got this super high level Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but a little bit like Mackenzie Dern last weekend, doesn't always commit hard enough to his offensive wrestling to, get fights to the ground where he can use that world-class Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Last weekend, we saw Mackenzie Dern do a really good job of using offensive wrestling to get Amanda Lemos to the ground. Thought Dern was really unlucky not to win that fight. Will we see Ortega kind of do the same as what we saw Dern do last weekend and come out and grapple hard again? And if he does, I think he stands a really good chance of causing Rodriguez huge problems here. So, for me, this is not necessarily a question of whether Ortega can get Rodriguez down. It's whether he chooses to or not before he either gets knocked out or takes so much damage to the point where he's too beat up and hurt to be able to get Rodriguez down. Because one thing about Rodriguez is great footwork, great movement, devastating kicks. And while he does still slow down a lot as fights wear on, he's still capable of killing you up until the very last second. Just ask Mr. Chan Sung Jung, who was obviously KO'd with 1 second left to go in their fight back in 2018. So Rodriguez is very, very dangerous, very tough. He's an absolute dog, and he is going to inflict massive amount of damage on Ortega on the feet. Bad. It's going to be ugly. And Rodriguez starts fast. The first few minutes of this fight is going to be ugly to watch. Rodriguez is going to be hammering the legs and body of Ortega and having a lot of success on the feet. That just reminds me of something that I almost forgot to mention, so we need to mention this. Even though I do think Ortega will cope better with the altitude than Rodriguez because his cardio is a lot better than Rodriguez's, one thing that could change this is Yair Rodriguez's body kicks. His body kicks are absolutely devastating. Like, if someone said to me, you have to stand with your hands up in the air and let someone smash you across the ribs with a fucking baseball bat, or you need to let Yair Rodriguez kick you across the ribs repeatedly with his body kicks, what are you going to choose? I'd be like, I'll take the baseball bat, please, because this guy is a fucking savage. His body kicks are devastating. We saw how much damage he inflicted on Josh Emmett in one of his recent fights, and so this potentially changes things with the altitude, because even though Ortega's cardio is a lot better, if Rodriguez starts hammering the body and spamming those body kicks early, that can obviously damage the body of Ortega early in the fight, which could then obviously affect his cardio as the fight progresses. So that's just something to think about. But Ortega is a tough fucker. So we, in this breakdown, need to basically establish what are the chances of Rodriguez getting this fight to the ground, keeping the fight on the ground. What are the odds on Ortega getting the fight to the ground, keeping the fight on the ground? Well, when I started researching this fight, I knew that Yair Rodriguez's takedown defense and ground game was very bad, but I'd kind of forgotten how bad it was. Rodriguez's takedown defense and ground game is an absolute joke. In last week's breakdown video for Amanda Lemos versus Mackenzie Dern, we were showing how bad Lemos's takedown defense and ground game was, and then we saw that in the fight last week between Dern and Lemos. I mean, Rodriguez is exactly the same, has virtually no takedown defense. Like, his takedown defense is a little bit better than Lemos's, but not by much. And whenever I say something like this, I always get people kind of disputing what I say, and so whenever I do make strong statements such as that, I always bring you the footage to back it up. Because remember, everything that I do is based on facts, not opinions. I'm just basically summarizing things I've seen in fight footage for you guys when I do these breakdowns. So what I'm going to do is play you some footage of Yair Rodriguez's takedown defense and ground game, and then I'm going to show you a little bit of Ortega's offensive wrestling. There's not a whole lot there, but then you can kind of see why this fight becomes a bit of a minefield for betting. And I'm not going to waste time showing you footage of how much better Rodriguez is than Ortega on the feet, because I think that's a universally accepted fact. We all know if the fight stays standing, Ortega's in a lot of trouble. I think we can all agree on that. So I don't want to drag this breakdown video out by showing you footage of how they match up on the feet. I think we can all agree Rodriguez is a nightmare and Ortega's in a lot of trouble when it comes to striking. But I think a lot of people betting this fight this weekend perhaps don't appreciate how bad Rodriguez is on the ground. So we do need to show some footage of that. And what we are going to do, where shall we begin? Where shall we begin? Should we go Holloway to Volk, or should we go Volk to Holloway? I tell you what, we'll go Holloway to Volk, because then you can see that there really hasn't been any improvement in Rodriguez's takedown defense and ground game. So we'll start off with Mr. Holloway, and again, we're not really focusing on strikings. We can all accept Rodriguez is significantly better than Ortega on the feet. So what I'm going to be doing is skipping through to grappling positions, and you can kind of see where I'm coming from. So only a tiny little bit of grappling in round one. Late on, Rodriguez ends up kind of falling over here, just gets caught off balance, throwing a knee. Nothing too major, but one thing you do notice about Rodriguez, and this will be a recurring theme throughout all of the footage that I play for you in this video, is I always talk about what I want to see from a fighter when they first hit the ground. So we know 9 times out of 10, if you're on your back, you're in a losing position. And so you want to get out of that position as quickly as possible. The best example I've got in the history of MMA for illustrating what you should do when you first hit the ground is, you know, old school Team Alpha Male alumni. If you think about Uriah Faber, Chad Mendes, TJ Dillashaw, Danny Castillo, Cody Garbrandt, this stable of fighters, as soon as those guys would hit the ground, they would immediately pop back up to their feet like a spring before their opponent had an opportunity to jump in the top position and establish a dominant position. When you see a guy do what Rodriguez does, it is red flag city, because even though there's only 15 seconds left in the round and he may be thinking, I don't want to exert a lot of energy to get back up to my feet because it's a waste of energy with the round being over, this will be a recurring theme in all of the footage that I show you of Rodriguez that I want you to watch out for. He's one of these guys that as soon as he hits the ground, instead of thinking, I need to get back up now, he immediately lies on his back and doesn't show any urgency to pop back up, which is the opposite of what he should be doing. And you see it here. He throws a flying knee, falls over, but Holloway's not on top of him. As soon as he hits the ground here, he should be immediately looking to explode back up to his feet or scramble over to the cage, but instead he just kind of starts kicking and stuff. And what this does is enable your opponent to get into top position. And this is a mistake that Yair makes over and over and over again, which could obviously get him into a lot of trouble against someone like Brian Ortega, because if Ortega gets on top of you, you're in a fucking universe of trouble. As Volk found out when he defended one of the fucking deepest mounted guillotines I've seen in the history of the UFC. So just skipping through, looking for grappling positions. Obviously I have watched this fight, but they all kind of blend into one. You forget what happens from round to round when you watch, fucking 50 fights in a week or whatever I've been watching. Alright, so here's another example again. Rodriguez kind of falls over. I think he was thinking about rolling for a leg or something there, but again, instead of showing urgency to pop back up, kind of just fucks around on the ground. And again, it might be because it's late in the round and he's like, I can't be bothered exerting energy to get back up, but it ain't a good thing to end rounds on the bottom. Okay, so here we go. So here's a bit more grappling. So we're now into round 3. We're now at the stage in the fight where Rodriguez is getting tired and sloppy. So what you'll notice about Rodriguez is early in the fight, round 1, light on his feet, throwing spinning shit, you know what I mean, looking very dangerous, very technical. Then as the fight wears on, he becomes progressively more flat-footed. And when he becomes progressively more flat-footed, that's a sign that he's starting to get tired. And that's what you see in this third round against Holloway. Notice how flat-footed he is now. He stood right in front of Holloway, and he becomes a lot easier to hit because he doesn't have the energy to throw the same volume to back him up. So again, here you see Rodriguez go down very easily. Here it's not even really a takedown. He just throws a kick and falls over. And again, even though here Holloway's giving him a lot of space to pop back up to his feet, he just fucks around on his back and just kind of allows Holloway to get on top of him, which again is very bad because when you fuck around like that, you give your opponent an opportunity to mount you. And so Holloway starts working for a head and arm choke, goes back to mount, and just generally speaking, Yair Rodriguez looks very, very weak off his back. Tries to use the cage to push off with his feet, try and buck Holloway off, but Holloway's top game is pretty heavy and he's just very comfortable. Now again, I don't want to make this breakdown super long as I've got a lot of footage that I want to get through, but I'll just skim through this so you can just kind of see that Rodriguez is just very, very bad on the ground. Remember, if we time check it, he first went down with like 3 minutes 45 left to go in round 3. If we hit play, skip through, it takes him pretty much 2 whole minutes to work back up to his feet, which isn't great because that's 2 minutes against Max Holloway, who's not a particularly strong grappler. Obviously, he's primarily a striker. 2 minutes on the ground with Holloway is not great, but 2 minutes on the ground with Ortega will likely mean that you're choked unconscious. So, not good from Rodriguez. But anyways, back up, all good, all good, all good. And then towards the end of the round, after Holloway had so much success against Rodriguez on the ground in that position, he's like, you know what? Let's just take this guy down and make life easy for myself. And you can see Rodriguez gives up a very cheap takedown there with about 50 seconds left to go in round 3. And Holloway just chips away at him for the rest of the round. So it's not good when a guy like Max Holloway is dominating you on the ground. Can you guys think of any other guy Holloway has ever dominated on the ground? I can't. I think Rodriguez might be the only one. Let me know in the comments or on Discord if you can think of anyone else. So anyway, here in this position now, into round 4, Rodriguez tired, sloppy, gassed, and Holloway just starts fishing for a guillotine. And Rodriguez defends it by flopping to his back, which is the correct thing to do. But obviously winds up in being on the bottom, and perhaps Holloway wouldn't have got that guillotine if he showed a little bit more urgency to address it when he was setting it up against the cage. Anyway, Rodriguez now awful on the ground, weak off his back, dreadful, 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 nothing off his back, terrible, getting dominated, mounted, back taken, elbowed, everything. Gets back up again after about 2 minutes. And that's it for that round. Into round 5. And again, for me, the takedown defense is bad for Rodriguez, but what's worse is how weak he is off his back. He's one of these guys that once he's on his back, he's so easy to hold down. So, again, Holloway, I mean, why do that, bro? Like, just terrible fight IQ. Just throwing, like, fucking Mortal Kombat type kicks. I just don't know why you would do that. To be honest, the probability of you achieving anything with a kick like that is so low. He does hit a reversal, but putting yourself in a position where you might end up on the bottom isn't smart when, you know, your opponent has caused you so many problems from top position. But anyway, that's pretty much round 5. But that's just one fight, right? Might have been an off night for Rodriguez. So we'll look at some more footage. So the next one we'll take a look at is actually the man himself, Mr. Brian Ortega. Now, when I watched, my perception or my memory of this fight was very different from the reality. So in my mind, before I watched this fight back this week, I thought that this was one of those fights where Yair kind of destroyed Ortega on the feet, and then there was some kind of position where Ortega just kind of fell apart and dislocated his shoulder. That's what I thought happened. Not really what happened, and we'll show you now. Obviously, the fight was a long time ago. It was all the way back in 2022. And I've only got so much hard drive space with how many fights I watch, which is why my memory of this fight wasn't the best. That's why we do fight research, to jog our memories and burn into our brains for live betting what is actually true. This is what's true. What's true is Rodriguez's takedown offense and ground game is an absolute joke. So if we look at the fight, how this goes, we can see obviously Rodriguez just blasts Ortega on the feet, beats him up on the feet, smashes him with kicks, absolutely cruises. But also another thing to pay attention to, right? Obviously we didn't really focus on the striking of Yair in the Holloway fight. We're not going to go into that, or this breakdown is going to be super long. But remember what I said about Rodriguez's footwork being a clue to him getting tired? So Rodriguez, light on his feet, moving around a lot in this first round. But then you can see in that third round against Holloway, way more flat-footed than this, right? Look how light Rodriguez is on his feet here. Lots of footwork, lots of movement. When that starts to go away, Rodriguez getting tired. Anyway, we're not focusing on striking because then this breakdown is going to be super duper 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 long. So we'll skip through and we'll get to the grappling positions. So we know that Brian Ortega doesn't have the best offensive wrestling, right? We're not going to see him shoot many double legs, that kind of thing. Doesn't really have chain wrestling. Not saying he hasn't developed this since 2022, but it's not typically something that we see from him. So he gets blasted for the first minute and 10 seconds of this round, where he's kind of lighting Rodriguez up, and then has when Rodriguez is lighting him up, then Ortega's like, this isn't great, I need to stop this because I'm taking a lot of damage, and kind of just grabs a hold of Rodriguez and drives him into the cage, which is what happens here. He gets to the body lock and just kind of walks Rodriguez over into the cage, into the clinch. Now from this position, Ortega and Rodriguez spend a few minutes in this position and not a lot happens. Ortega tries to upset Rodriguez's balance a couple times but doesn't really commit to it, and they kind of just stall in the clinch for a little bit of time with a whole lot of nothing happening. Basically, it's going to be very difficult for Ortega to obviously upset Rodriguez's balance with his control of Rodriguez's body being above hip height. So Ortega eventually realizes, I don't really have anything here, and after a little bit of time just fucking around up against the cage, they break. They go back to the middle of the octagon, and then we actually see Ortega fully commit to his first takedown of round 1. He gets it quite easily. So with 1 minute and 20 seconds left to go in round 1, you see him shoot a single leg here. There's the single leg, drives Rodriguez into the cage, and I'm really surprised at how easily Rodriguez goes down here. Watch, Ortega just kind of hits some kind of judo throw into side control and then dislocates his shoulder in this position. So yeah, it's just very surprised at how easily Rodriguez went down here. Because from this position you think, well, Ortega doesn't really have anything. He's in on a high crotch single leg, but isn't the most physically imposing grappler, and Rodriguez should have enough balance, you know, good enough takedown offense to neutralize this position. And the fact that he kind of just allows Ortega to get in deep enough on his legs from here to upset his balance, I mean, that's shockingly bad from Rodriguez, man. That ain't good. That ain't good at all. So, straight away, that ain't good. So, now, let's take a look at the Emmett fight. Because it continues, man. It continues. It gets worse. So, we already said Rodriguez inflicts significant damage on Emmett in this round. Big damage with body kicks. And then, with 1 minute and 30 odd seconds left to go in round 1, we can see Rodriguez ends up on the bottom. Again, just falls over. That's the thing about Rodriguez that's most shocking to me. When you go back and watch his past fights, you don't even need to take him down. Like, he does it himself a lot of the time. Like, he falls over so much. So here he's fallen over with 1 minute and 30 left to go in round 1, which just enables Emmett to take side control. And again, I don't want to make this breakdown super long, so I'm just going to skip through it. But Emmett just holds him down easily for the remainder of the round, just like dominates him from top position. Like, that's the end of the round there, and Emmett had 1.5 minutes of top control. And again, this is Josh Emmett, this is Max Holloway, compared to guys like you know, Brian Ortega that can really make you pay. Then if we go into round 2, again, Emmett continues to get blasted on the feet until towards the end of the round. 2 minutes left to go in the round. Again, Rodriguez just falls over. You know, Emmett did grab a single leg, but again, basically falls over, throwing a flying knee. And, you know, less than 2 minutes left to go. Emmett holding Rodriguez down. Rodriguez making no effort to get back up to his feet at all. Just hits a Hail Mary triangle out of nowhere. Now, whenever I break down fights like this and show footage, there will be guys on Discord or guys in the comments that'll be like, Rodriguez is nasty off his back, his BJJ is amazing, he can hang with Ortega on the ground, look what he did to Emmett off his back. Oh man, guys, come on, let's get real. Rodriguez is awful off his back, okay? If you're holding that opinion, go do some research, because Rodriguez is dreadful off his back, very weak off his back, and if Ortega gets in top of him, he's in a universe of trouble. What I think happened in this fight, I mean, this was one of the slowest triangle setups I've ever seen. I think what happened in this fight is that Emmett took so much damage on the feet. You know, Rodriguez really hurt him with body kicks in this one, that as soon as he got caught in a bad position, he was like, fuck it, I'm just going to tap. I can't be bothered playing anymore. No disrespect to Emmett, but I think that's what happened, because guys like Josh Emmett don't get caught in triangles from guys like Yair Rodriguez unless they're pretty badly hurt. He could have defended that quite easily, in my opinion. Anyway, that was the Emmett fight, and we then move into one more bit of footage that I want to show you, which is going to be Mr. Alexander Volkanovski against Yair Rodriguez. So we will skim through this one as well, because we don't want to make the breakdown any longer than it needs to be. But I think by now you're probably getting the vibe that Rodriguez is very difficult to trust. So round 1, again, look again. This isn't really Volkanovski taking Rodriguez down. Rodriguez kind of leaps to the ground. Watch this. He throws a kick. Volk kind of catches it, but then Rodriguez doesn't try and stuff him. He just kind of tries to cuddle Volkanovski like a baby monkey. Like, you know when you see a baby monkey holding their mum and she's like carrying him around? I mean, what the fuck is going on here? Like, he doesn't even try to stuff the takedown, man. He just kind of wraps his legs around Volk. Like, what is that? What is that? So, again, dreadful, 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 dreadful takedown defense. So that's like 3.5 minutes left to go in round 1. And, again, Rodriguez just gets held down so easily. So easily. Eventually pops back up to his feet. But Volk gets him back down easily. And it's just very, very bad takedown defense. Very, very weak off his back. So into round 2. Again, very, very cheap takedown. I know it's Volkanovski, guys, but Jesus Christ. It is so easy to upset this guy's balance. 3 minutes left to go in round 2. Again, you know, pops back up there, but I made my point, right? Again, gets dragged down easily there. Just levels to the game on the ground, man. And Ortega is levels and levels and levels and levels and levels above this guy. So, into round 3. Volk just kind of... He has hurt him on the feet, but he just kind of picks him up. And just kind of smashes him. Like, Rodriguez just got virtually no takedown defense at all. But people think he does. But he doesn't. It's dreadful. And that's basically it. So, that is basically it. So, what's tricky about this fight is that Rodriguez has absolutely no takedown defense or ground game whatsoever. He's dreadful on the ground. He's facing a super high-level Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioner that can submit him in an instant, right? Split second, you make a mistake, Ortega's the kind of guy that can put you away. But this is one of those fights where I really dislike betting it because you're not putting your money in a super strong position no matter who you go with. Because Ortega is just as bad on the feet as Rodriguez is on the ground. Now, my lean is definitely Ortega. Because with Ortega's grappling and how bad Rodriguez's takedown defense and ground game is, Ortega's got the ability to dictate where the fight takes place. And I also think Rodriguez is likely to get quite tired late on, which also favours Ortega. But at the same time, I wouldn't be surprised if Ortega looks awful after a long layoff. You know, comes into this fight and doesn't look good at all and just gets smoked on the feet. Now, he's a very, very, very tempting bet. Very tempting. Slight underdog odds. I think he can cause Rodriguez hell on the ground. But I just don't like betting fights where both guys have got extreme advantages in the area that the other is weak. I like to be in a position where I've bet a guy and there's no major risk factors. That's not the case here because Ortega's going to get lit up bad every single second of this fight is standing. So it's an interesting fight. It's a very difficult one for betting. Let me know what you think in the Discord though, or in the comments. Let me know what you think because it's a very interesting one. In terms of the over-under, I wouldn't touch the over-under on this because with how bad Rodriguez's takedown defense and ground game is, with how bad Ortega's striking defense is, I could see either one of these guys, or I could see Ortega getting knocked out any second. I could see Rodriguez getting submitted any second. But at the same time, because they're both very, very tough, it's not going to be easy to put either of them away. So I would just avoid that. In terms of the most likely outcome, the odds on Ortega by submission aren't great. I'm not going to be betting this myself, but a long shot prop that is interesting to me is Ortega to win in round 3. Because it's about the 3rd round where Rodriguez usually starts to look pretty tired. So you could see a situation where Rodriguez is kind of lighting Ortega up on the feet. In like rounds 1 and 2. Ortega kind of toughs it out and hangs in there because he is a tough fucker. And then when Rodriguez slows in the second half of the fight, Ortega kind of finds a way to get him down and strangles him. And the 3rd round is about a good time in that fight for that to happen. Again, it's a long shot. The odds are reflective of the fact that bet's not going to win a super high percentage of the time. But if you want to sprinkle a little bit of money on this fight to make watching it more interesting, that's not a bad prop in my opinion. So you might want to go for that one. So I hope you found that useful. If you did, please hit the subscribe button. I really would love to grow this channel more. It would mean a lot to me. And like if you haven't already, like the video as we get into the next fight, which is going to be Daniel Zellhuber against Francisco Prado. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that Zellhuber is a pretty big favourite, average odds of around 1.36, which is minus 278 for an implied probability of 74%. If we take a look at the odds on Prado, he's around an average of 3.20, which is going to be plus 220 for an implied probability of 31%. So Zellhuber is 24 years old, 6'1" with a 77-inch reach. Prado, 21 years old, 5'11", 69-inch reach. So, couple of interesting X factors on this one. Now, obviously, both guys are very young, 21 years old, 24 years old, respectively. But 21 years old is like really, really, really young to be in the UFC. That probably gives Zellhuber a bit of an edge here. Prado's very young, very inexperienced. Now he's going into Mexico to fight a popular Mexican fighter at high altitude in front of a bunch of crazy Mexican fans. That in itself is difficult. Like Prado's cardio is usually pretty good. So the altitude may not affect him too badly, but this is a difficult set of circumstances to be fighting under. And of course Zellhuber's cardio is very good. He's probably going to cope pretty well with the altitude. So already that's quite difficult for Prado to deal with. On top of that, Zellhuber's got an enormous 8-inch reach advantage. And so, statistically, fighters with an 8-inch reach advantage win around 67% of the time. So even before we talk about how these two match up stylistically, Prado's fighting under difficult circumstances against a hometown guy, altitude, all that shit. Plus, he's facing an enormous reach differential. Having to overcome an enormous reach differential, which is not going to be an easy thing to do. Then when we get into how these two match up stylistically, it's also a pretty bad fight for Prado. If we quickly cover off grappling, I'm probably not going to see a whole lot of grappling in this fight because both these guys are primarily strikers, but you never know, so we'll talk about it. Prado's takedown offense and ground game's pretty bad. Zellhuber's primarily a striker, so it might not matter, but if Zellhuber were to grapple, or if Prado were to grapple, Zellhuber's the better grappler in this fight by some significant margin, and the fact that he's a lot bigger than Prado will help him kind of control Prado and outwork him on the ground. So Zellhuber, pretty big advantage on the ground. Now, in terms of how these two match up when it comes to striking, again, Zellhuber does a good job of using his length. He fights long. He's very technical. It's going to be very difficult for Prado to get inside and land on Zellhuber. So Zellhuber should be pretty comfortable on the feet in this when he should just be able to chip away at Prado from a safe distance, rack up volume, outstrike Prado. Now, there's two issues I've got with Zellhuber, two weaknesses in his skill set, which are probably not going to cost him in this fight, but they're just worth keeping in mind if you're thinking of betting him as a big favourite, because they are risk factors which should be considered. The first issue with Zellhuber is that he's a little bit like Ian Gary in some sense, in that for the most part he does a really good job of using his length to chip away at his opponents from a safe distance, but at times starts to feel himself, get a little bit overconfident, sit down on his shots and look to beat guys in exchanges. And when he does that, he doesn't read his opponents particularly well. Doesn't move his head that much. Tends to eat clean, hard shots which are perfectly capable of knocking him out. That's a bit of a risk factor because Prado does hit very hard. Prado's one of these guys that likes to march forward, tanky body type, small compact muscular frame, just kind of bob and weave and get inside and load up on big power shots. You can see his foundation style is street fighting. That's pretty accurate from what I've seen of this guy. But yeah, very one-dimensional, comes forward, very boxing-based style of fighting, tries to get inside and load up on the big power shots. If Zellhuber doesn't play that game, stays on the outside, uses length to chip away at Prado, very, very difficult night for Prado. But if Zellhuber starts to get into big exchanges with Prado, that's when Prado could potentially land a bomb, cause Zellhuber some trouble. The other weakness that Zellhuber's got, which I don't think is going to cost him in this fight, but it's worth knowing, is at times he's very passive. Zellhuber's one of these guys that does struggle to put his stamp on rounds because for the most part he's a volume striker. He just kind of chips away at you. The issue with Zellhuber sometimes is that you get long periods of inactivity where he doesn't really achieve very much, which leads to some of his rounds being visually close. Again, that's probably not going to be an issue for him because if rounds are close in Mexico, you'd assume that the Mexican judges would give Zellhuber, the hometown guy, the nod. But it's again a risk factor that you should be aware of. You know, whenever you're dealing with guys in this odds range, there really shouldn't be any significant risk factors. In order for me to bet a fighter in this odds range, in my opinion, they should have virtually no way to lose. And so for that reason, you need to be a little bit careful with Mr. Zellhuber this weekend. So that's pretty much how these two match up. Very bad fight for Prado. Zellhuber should get this done easily. In terms of the over-under on this one, I do think there's a pretty good chance this fight goes deep. The over 1.5 rounds is interesting to me. Definitely considering the over 1.5 rounds on this one. Not sure if I'll bet it yet. I'll obviously let you know in the Discord. I'll give it a bit more thought. But it's interesting to me just because both guys are very tough. If you look at Zellhuber's record, he frequently goes deep in fights. It's one of those things where he had a lot of finishes before he came to the UFC. Then as soon as he faces a step up in competition, he starts to go very deep in fights. And then when you look at Prado's record, kind of a similar story. Lots of finishes. And then when he makes his debut, all of a sudden goes to a decision when he faces that step up in competition. He did knock Aizatar out in his last fight, but it's not going to be as easy to put Zellhuber away because Zellhuber does a much better job of using his length. So pretty good chance this one goes deep. The thing that makes me most nervous about betting the over on this fight would be, with both of them being very inexperienced, Prado 21, Zellhuber 24, you know, for the most part, these guys don't have that much experience fighting in the kind of atmosphere we're going to see in Mexico City. We know the fans are crazy over there, and the atmosphere is going to be absolutely buzzing during the main card. I just worry that both these two are quite scrappy. They do both love to throw down. Like, they can both be dragged into a war, no problem. And so these two are perhaps more likely to just go to war with the atmosphere in the arena kind of influencing their judgment into making them kind of go crazy, basically, and give the fans what they want. And now that would certainly be a risk factor to the over. If this fight were in the Apex or on neutral territory or on the early prelims, I'd be a lot more optimistic about the over hitting. With it being in an arena where it's likely to have an electrified atmosphere, this is the kind of fight which could get nuts. And whenever you have that kind of fight, finishes are more likely. So that's why I'm not so sure. I'll give you some thought. I'll let you know in the Discord if you're a member of our community. All right. In terms of the props on this one, most likely outcome is Zellhuber by decision. So, not going to be betting it myself. I don't like props, but if you want to sprinkle a little bit of money on this fight to make watching more interesting, Zellhuber by decision is the one for you. That is the most likely prop to hit on this fight, in my opinion. Could be wrong. I'm just an idiot on the internet who knows absolutely nothing about MMA, as lots of people like to remind me regularly. Alright, now let's get into the next fight on this card, one of the most interesting fights on this card, in my opinion, Raul Rosas Jr. versus Mr. Ricky Turcios. And what's very interesting about this fight is when I researched the fight yesterday, I came to the conclusion that this could be a really tricky fight for Raul Rosas Jr. And it's 10th. Well, I started recording this video at like 9:30 a.m. this morning, so I haven't really checked the odds this morning because I've literally just woken up, had a shower, got dressed, come down, turned my camera on, started recording the video straight away. So I haven't really checked the odds movement and stuff since last night. So as I'm recording this video, it's kind of the first time I'm seeing the odds for today. And just in the last fight that we were breaking down, I noticed that there's been quite a bit of odds movement on this fight. So we can see that Raul Rosas Jr. earlier this week was a much bigger favourite than he is now. We've seen about a 25% improvement in Raul Rosas' odds in the last sort of 24 hours, which is a pretty big jump on a Thursday. And we've also, obviously, on the flip side, as a result of that, seen Turcios' odds kind of decline, which is interesting. I can definitely see why people are gambling on Turcios here. It's definitely a gamble, but this is one of those fights which I do think could be potentially very difficult for Raul Rosas Jr. But this is a complex matchup, so before you rush on the Discord or the comment section and tell me Turcios sucks and Rosas Jr. is going to fucking maul him on the ground, all that kind of stuff, just hear me out, listen to what I've got to say. Maybe you feel a little bit differently. So if we look into the X factors on this one, Raul Rosas Jr. is 19 years old, 5'9" with a 67-inch reach. Turcios, 30 years old, 5'9", 71-inch reach. So we can see that Turcios has a 4-inch reach advantage in this fight, and I don't think it's really going to mean anything in the context of this matchup because he doesn't really know how to use it. Now, age is not just a number in MMA. It is meaningful, does mean stuff, but age statistics in MMA are only as useful, or only useful if they're interpreted correctly. So we know that the younger fighter wins around 70% of the time when there is an 11-year age gap in a fight, which is what we have here. However, that is, you know, a statistic that is strong for when you get these young, hungry bulls facing these old, declining veterans. In matchups such as this, where you've got an extremely young fighter in Raul Rosas Jr., 19 years old, it's just way too young to be in the UFC. I know there's a lot of hype on this guy. I know Dana loves this guy. I just don't know why. I don't know why he's in the UFC at 19. I honestly can't think of any other fighter who came into the UFC super young and it ended well other than John Jones. He's literally only one. Sage Northcutt, how did that work out? Paige Van Zandt, how did that work out? Chase Hooper, how did that work out? Maybe Raul Rosas Jr. is an outlier, but I just think when you bring these young guys into the UFC, when they're, basically teenagers, all that happens is their talent gets them to the point where they're in a position that they've built so much hype and racked up so many wins that they can't really face the lower level guys anymore, and so they have to start facing those step ups in competition. And when they do, even when they win, they just end up taking tons of damage, which shortens their career, and they don't get an opportunity to become experienced. And look, MMA is not a safe environment, so when I say safe environment, it's not safe, but what I'm trying to say is it's a lot easier to earn experience in, CFFC or LFA as opposed to the Ultimate Fighting Championship, even though, to be fair, the standard of athlete in the UFC's fallen off a fucking cliff since COVID came in. Please, Dana, leave, and please can we get a new CEO now. But yeah, matchmaking's awful these days. Standard of fighters declined significantly, but it still ain't easy cutting your teeth in the UFC, because even though the level of fighter in the UFC is a lot worse than it used to be, you still reach a point where you've climbed the rankings enough to where you'll face guys that are reasonably good everywhere. And we saw what happened to Raul Rosas Jr. last time he fought someone who was reasonably good everywhere in Christian Rodriguez. He got dominated pretty much for the most part in that second and third round. So yeah, man, it's one of those situations, man, where I think it's just too much too soon. 19 years old is very young. So I'd even go as far as saying I haven't got the stats on this, and the reason why I haven't got the stats on this is because there aren't enough guys Raul Rosas Jr.'s age in the UFC for there to be enough fights to actually gather good quality data on this. But if I had to guess, you know how the younger fighter wins around 70% of the time when there's a 11-year age gap in a fight, when we're dealing with like these old veterans versus these young hungry bulls. I wouldn't be surprised if you can flip that stat on its head when you've got really young fighters like Raul Rosas Jr. facing guys who are in their prime like Turcios, because I think what happens a lot of the time is these guys like Raul Rosas Jr. just get big brothered. I don't know what the stats are. If you do, please let me know. The stat might not be that useful because, again, we're not getting tons of fighters this age in the UFC. But when you look at Sage Northcutt, Paige Van Zandt, etc., it ain't great. It ain't great. And as much as I do like Raul Rosas Jr. and I think he's good, there's this thing in life, and I see it on Discord every week. I see it in the YouTube comments every week, right? In like my line of work, everyone thinks they can do what I do. So every week people tell me where I'm wrong, what I've got wrong, what I've done wrong, what I've said wrong, where I predicted a fight wrong, blah, blah, blah. But a lot of the time with the stuff they say, they're wrong because they don't know what I know. So when they say something, they haven't got the level of experience to know that even though they may have won a bet that won, they actually made a mistake in placing that bet, because good bets don't always win, bad bets don't always lose. And the thing about this betting world is bookies need people to think that they're right to be profitable, right? Because if people didn't think they knew who was going to win or they were right, they would never place the bet. So you see a huge issue in the UFC world where people don't really understand betting on sports, but then if they win a bet on the UFC, they think they got it right and they were very smart. And that's dangerous because then they continue to bet in a certain way, which over a long term will produce losses if they're not, doing it correctly, right? You can kind of apply the same logic to guys like Raul Rosas Jr., where it's that saying in life, you don't know what you don't know. The thing about a guy like Raul Rosas Jr. is he's learning on the job. And so he's going to find himself in positions in the UFC which he just doesn't have the life experience or in-cage athletic experience to deal with. So when you go up against a maniac like Ricky Turcios, who's got a lot more life experience, he's a rough, tough, mean, nasty guy that's lived life and been kicked in the nuts by life and had a really tough life, and he's been hurt in fights, he's been knocked down in fights, he's been tired in fights, and he just keeps pushing, even though both guys have got not a huge difference in their number of career fights, to be fair. In terms of experience, their universe is apart. So whenever I look at a guy like Raul Rosas Jr., it reminds me a lot of just situations where people don't know what they don't know. And with Rosas Jr., I worry for him this weekend, I really do. So in terms of how these two match up from a stylistic point of view, first of all, let's talk about the X factor of altitude and this event being in Mexico City, right? So Raul Rosas Jr. is Mexican, and people love him. He's very hyped. So that in itself for me is a bit of a risk factor to Raul Rosas Jr. because he's fighting on the main card. We know the fans are really passionate and loud in Mexico. When he walks out on Saturday night, like, I know that he's got great reactions from the crowd in his past fights, but it's going to be another level in Mexico. So when he walks out, like, the atmosphere in that arena for me, are going to increase the probability of a guy like this adrenaline dumping. Because if he has any success in the fight, if he knocks Turcios down, if he lands a big shot, if he hits a takedown, crowd are going to go wild. And Rosas' emotions are going to be running like crazy, and it's going to be very difficult for him to keep them under control, keep his heart rate, breathing under control. So the probability of Raul Rosas Jr. adrenaline dumping in an atmosphere like this is pretty big. On top of that, even though he's Mexican, similar to the Ortega versus Rodriguez fight, I actually think this is one of those matchups where the high altitude climate favours the visitor, favours the away team. Because Turcios, similar to Ortega, is one of these guys that just seems to have never-ending genetic cardio, where he just keeps pushing, keeps fighting, and doesn't slow down. Whereas Raul Rosas Jr., he just doesn't have experience of pushing through and fighting effectively when tired. So that's a pretty big risk factor for me. It's one of those situations where home advantage might not actually be that much of an advantage this weekend for an inexperienced guy that just doesn't know how to manage it. So in terms of how these two match up stylistically, on the feet, obviously neither guy is particularly good. They're both primarily grapplers. They both have a base in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I'd actually still give the advantage to Rosas Jr. on the feet though. He seems a lot more technical than Turcios. He moves a lot better. For me, Turcios is just one of these sloppy brawlers on the feet. Doesn't have much power in his hands. Very bad defensively. But the thing is, even though Rosas Jr. is more skilled technically, Turcios is more comfortable in a dogfight. So while he may not look as pretty hitting pads as Rosas Jr., if this fight turns into a war and they both get tired, you know, Turcios would have the edge because he's just going to be able to out-hustle and outwork Rosas Jr. on the feet. That's just going to be the way it's going to go. Now, both these guys are primarily grapplers. You see the Gracie tattoo on Turcios' arm there. We know Raul Rosas Jr. is a grappler. And Turcios is one of these guys, very frustrating to watch, because even though he's a grappler, he's kind of fallen in love with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu to the extent that he doesn't really try to stuff takedowns. He's one of these BJJ guys that wants to be on his back hunting for long shot submissions, which is really, really disappointing because he just gets taken down so easily and spends so much on the bottom. And while his Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is alright, and while he does have a very active guard, again, we know that 9 times out of 10, if you're on your back in MMA, you're in a losing position. And so, with Raul Rosas Jr. being a good offensive wrestler, having a good top game, Turcios being the kind of guy that gives up cheap takedowns, spends a lot of time on the bottom, it is on paper at least a good stylistic matchup for Raul Rosas Jr. because he should be able to hit takedowns and rack up a lot of top control on Turcios. And even if Turcios does have a super active guard, with Rosas Jr. having home advantage on his side, it's not going to be easy for Turcios to win this fight by decision off his back. It's going to be very, very difficult in Mexico City. However, what Turcios can do with his active guard is make Rosas Jr. work very, very hard to maintain dominant positions on the ground. And that's where this fight gets tricky, because even though Turcios gives up cheap takedowns and Rosas Jr. can kind of dominate him on the ground, Turcios also has the ability to make Rosas Jr. work really hard, burn through a lot of energy in grappling positions. That's where this fight gets interesting. Is Rosas Jr. experienced enough to win a 3-round war of attrition at high altitude against an absolute maniac warhorse, gritty tough dog like Ricky Turcios? I'm not so sure. So from a betting point of view, you'd have to be a total lunatic, in my opinion, to bet an unproven, inexperienced 19-year-old at big favourite odds in a fight such as this. If you want to bet this fight, you've absolutely got to go Ricky Turcios. This is clearly dog or pass, which is why I think we're starting to see odds movement now in favour of Turcios. If you're going to bet this fight, you've got to go with the underdog. He gives you by far the better risk to reward ratio. But if you do bet Ricky Turcios, it's a very risky bet because he's fighting a hometown guy with hometown advantage who has the ability to take him down, control him on the ground, rack up a lot of grappling control. And for that reason, it's probably better off passing on this one. So in terms of the over-under on this fight, do think this fight's very likely to go deep, because I think if there were to be a stoppage, it would come late on when Raul Rosas Jr. were to potentially get tired. Not saying it will definitely happen, but that's more likely the way it goes. But in the Christian Rodriguez fight, Raul Rosas Jr. showed that he's tough, he can hang in there, but then it's going to be a lot tougher to hang in there at high altitude. When you're tired, you might not have the energy to defend yourself if you're put in a bad position. So this fight is pretty likely to go deep, but the odds reflect that. And as a result, it's kind of dangerous to bet it, but the over is pretty tempting on this one. In terms of the props, so I was hoping the odds on Turcios by decision would be a lot better. For me, 5.0 plus 400 is a bit shit. I would just bet the money line if you want to bet this fight. If you want to place a bet to make watching this more interesting, sprinkle a little bit of money, take Turcios money line. Don't be fucking around with props or that kind of stuff. I'm not going to bet it myself, but gambling's a form of entertainment, right? I know a lot of you guys watching this want to play some bets for fun. I would just go with Turcios money line, even if it is very risky because of how these two match up stylistically. So I hope you found that useful. If you did find it useful, please hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already. Help me grow this channel, for fuck's sake. I've been doing this a long time. I would love to have more subscribers. You guys can help me get there. Now let's break down the next fight on this card, which is going to be Jauregui versus Sam Hughes. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that Jauregui is the favourite at average odds of around 1.19, which is going to be minus 526 for an implied probability of 84%. We take a look at the odds on Sam Hughes, we can see that she's around an average of 4.90, which is going to be plus 390 for an implied probability of 20%. So Jauregui, 24 years old, 5'3" with a 64-inch reach. Sam Hughes, 31 years old, 5'5", 64.5-inch reach. Both girls roughly the same size. Age isn't going to come into this one, and I don't think altitude and the Mexico City thing is going to come into this one either. Obviously, it's nice that Jauregui has home advantage, but this is a great stylistic matchup for her, whichever way you dress it up. Both girls have got pretty good cardio. I don't think altitude's going to have a massive issue on this fight. It's certainly not going to bother Jauregui. It may bother Sam Hughes, but I think Jauregui's punches to her face is going to bother her a lot more than the altitude. So I don't want to spend too long on this breakdown. This is a matchup where Jauregui is significantly better than Sam Hughes in every single aspect of MMA. Sam Hughes has virtually no realistic path to victory here. It's very, very rare that you'll hear me talk like this. But Sam Hughes has no realistic way to win, in my opinion. And it's very, very, very rare you'll hear me talk like that. You know, a lot of guys that talk about betting on MMA will use phrases like free money and lock. And to me, when I hear guys talk like that, it's just a lack of experience, because there's no such thing really as free money or locks in this sport. It's a very complex sport, chaotic sport where anything can happen. And pretty much every fighter in every fight has got different paths to victory. If you bet someone you think they're a lock and they win, doesn't mean they were a lock, just means that that's how things played out in the universe that night. You know, anything can happen in MMA. It's one of the reasons why we love it. But every once in a while, a fight will come along, and it's very, very rare where you research it and you're like, this fighter needs an absolute miracle in order to win. I think the last fight I saw like that was when Jasmine Jazz Duvicius fought Priscilla Cachoeira a few weeks ago. It's a terrible stylistic matchup for Cachoeira. As a result, Jazz Duvicius dominated. The problem is, whenever we get fights which are virtually free money, the odds reflect that, and the fighter that is super likely to win has that reflected in their odds, and we can see Jauregui massive favourite. But to quickly sum this one up, Yasmin is a significantly better striker and a significantly better grappler. I won't waste time explaining why, she just is. And in terms of ways in which Sam Hughes could win, I mean, she doesn't have knockout power, so even though Jauregui's not the best defensively, it's not very likely Hughes would be able to deliver a shot with enough power to knock Jauregui out, so that's unlikely. Jauregui's MMA grappling is very good, and Sam Hughes' submission grappling isn't that dangerous, so unlikely Sam Hughes would be able to submit Jauregui, and it's very unlikely that Sam Hughes would be able to win a decision, because Jauregui's got home advantage on her side. Mexican judges and crowd are going to love her. On top of that, Jauregui is a significantly better grappler, significantly better striker than Hughes. She's better everywhere. So, you know, it's one of those fights where I would be amazed if Sam Hughes were able to make this competitive. It's a giant squash match and terrible matchmaking. In terms of the over-under on this one, this is one of those fights where I am a little bit tempted to bet on the under. Sam Hughes is very tough. She's an absolute dog. It's not going to be easy for Jauregui to get her out of there. We can see she's an absolute decisionator. However, Jauregui is a giant step up in competition from the kind of girls that Sam Hughes has been facing. And what we have seen in Sam Hughes' previous fights is that she does take a lot of damage on the feet if she can't get her opponents to the ground. She gets busted up very, very bad because she's slow and her striking defense is not good. Jauregui is mean, nasty, and does have knockout power. I could see her knocking Hughes out in this fight. So, fight not to go to a decision is actually very tempting on this. Now, it's probably not smart to bet on a strawweight fight not to go to a decision because the majority of strawweight fights do go to decisions. But if ever there were a strawweight fight which is likely to end inside the distance, it would be this one because I think Sam Hughes is going to get absolutely annihilated on the feet. So, hope you found that useful. Now let's break down the final fight on this main card, which is going to be Manuel Torres against Chris Duncan. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that Manuel Torres is the favourite and his odds have declined a fair amount in the last few days, which is insane to me for reasons we'll talk about shortly. But anyway, people love Torres in this fight. I definitely favour him, but I mean, to bet him in this matchup is a gamble to say the least, for reasons I'll explain shortly. So Torres is the favourite at average odds of around 1.57, which is going to be minus 175 for an implied probability of 64%. If we take a look at the odds on Duncan, he's around an average of, say, 2.50, which is going to be plus 150 for an implied probability of 40%. So Torres, 28 years old, 5'10", 73-inch reach. Duncan, 30 years old, 5'10", 71-inch reach. So both guys roughly the same size, roughly the same age. Nothing major there. Now, for me, I'm amazed that the odds are declining on Torres in this one, because how the fuck could you know anything about him? If you look at his record, every single one of his fights dating back to 2018 has ended in the first round. So why are you betting this guy? I don't get it. We don't know anything about him. We know zero. We don't know anything about his cardio. We don't know how he's going to look into rounds 2 and 3. We don't know anything about his takedown offense and ground game. He's only ever been to a decision once. So I just don't know why people would be betting this guy. Yes, his boxing looks really good. And, you know, he's Mexican. But other than that, why the fuck would you be betting him? And he's around about a 64% favourite. So, I mean, really, you'd have to be capping this guy at like 70% to get a decent margin of value over the bookies. And since we don't know anything about him, really, that's fucking insanity. So, I don't know who these guys are moving the odds on Torres. Maybe there's some, inside information out there on, maybe Chris Duncan being injured or something. I don't know what the fuck's going on. But yeah, there's literally no footage on Torres which gives us like definitive answers on what this guy's capable of. It's just a bit of a gamble if you bet this guy, in my opinion. Now, I do favour him. Because based on what I've seen, his boxing's decent. He's Mexican. It's really all I've got to say, to be fair. I do favour him. Duncan's very limited in many ways, but he's also, battle tested. We've seen him go the distance. He's got more experience than Torres. I mean, people are actually betting Torres at the, guys, just between me and you, I know no one else is watching. Do people hate money? I just don't get it. Look at his record. There will be guys out there that are like, oh, I'm betting Torres because he's amazing. He's got knockout power. He's a great boxer. Da 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 da. And I'm like, yeah, okay, he is a great boxer. He does have knockout power. But what about all the other shit you have absolutely no idea about because there's no fucking footage available on it for you to even know anything. Basically, he could literally have the worst cardio in the history of the UFC. He could literally have worse takedown defense and a worse ground game than Yair Rodriguez. If you bet this guy, you're totally gambling. Now, I'm not opposed to totally gambling if you're getting a really good risk to reward ratio. If Torres was a big underdog, I'd be like, well, you know what? He is a good boxer. He does have knockout power. He does have home advantage. He's a giant underdog. He's got a good chance of winning. I can understand. The risk to reward ratio is there. When you're betting a guy at an implied probability of 64%, if you want to make a profit long term, you better bet your ass that there's no major risk factors with a guy, or you're going to get wrecked long term. And with a lack of footage on Torres, there's just no way to know, man. You are gambling. What are you doing? MMA betting public, betting this guy. Drives me crazy. I don't even really care, if I'm honest. I just want my camera to get back in focus. It's taking an eternity. Please come back in focus. There we go. The slow roll did it. I don't care if people are betting Torres. I really don't give a fuck. I'm just trying to highlight that it's a bit silly when you see guys like this getting bet. Anyway, how do both these guys match up from a stylistic point of view? Well, it is difficult to say with a lack of footage on Torres, but what I can do is explain to you most likely how these two match up stylistically based on a very limited amount of footage that we do have available on Torres. So in terms of how altitude may impact this fight, with Torres we just don't know, right? We've never seen him go past round one. He's been to a he's been to a decision one time, but you get what I mean. Very rare he's been past round one. So we don't know what his cardio is like. Don't know what he's going to be like in altitude. Now, we do know Mexican fighters tend to have pretty good cardio just genetically. That's just how they are. Mexican fighters are well known for having great cardio and being able to fight at a high pace in both MMA and boxing. But there's always exceptions to the rule. So maybe Torres is the exception to the rule. So we don't know. Duncan has pretty good cardio. Duncan has really good cardio, actually. But Duncan isn't the kind of, like, guy who can just sprint for 15 minutes non-stop, relentless genetic cardio like a Brian Ortega or a Ricky Turcios. He's got good cardio, but he's a little bit clunky, a little bit slow. So I do think Duncan's a guy that at altitude will slow down as the fights wear on. Hashtag no racist, but every race of fighter in MMA has certain characteristics attached to them. British fighters tend to have, generally speaking, certain strengths and weaknesses. Chinese fighters, certain strengths and weaknesses. Korean fighters, certain strengths and weaknesses. All these different, DNA lines have general strengths and weaknesses attached to them, right? Dagestani fighters, certain strengths and weaknesses. Chris Duncan's lived and trained and grown up in Scotland. I've actually been to Alloa in Scotland because I used to work a lot in Scotland, going back, fucking hell, a long time ago now. How long ago? Like 10 years ago? I used to work up in Scotland 10 years ago. I've been to this place. What I can tell you is it's very cold, it's very green, and they don't get much sunlight, and it rains a lot. Completely different climate to Mexico City. So it's not going to be easy for a guy like Chris Duncan, who's grown up in somewhere like Scotland, to then go and fight in Mexico City. It just isn't. Like, genetically, I know that he's trained at American Top Team in Florida, but, a lifetime or fucking an entire fucking, like, generations of Scottish DNA are not going to be negated by a few training camps in Florida. Fighting in Mexico City is going to be a lot more difficult for Duncan than it is for Manuel Torres. So even though his cardio is very good, he might be one of those guys who slows down a little bit. In terms of how they match up stylistically, based on what I've seen, difficult fight for Duncan on the feet. I like how Torres moves. In fact, remember Zhang on last week's card? Zhang was an even money bet. Zhang was a strong lean for me last week. And in the breakdown video for that fight, I kind of showed some footage of Zhang striking and how nasty he was on the feet. Mean, nasty, aggressive, heavy-handed, big boxing style. If you can remember Zhang from last week, Torres is like Zhang, but with slightly better defense and slightly better footwork. He's like a slightly more technical version of Zhang from last weekend that fought Brenson Ribeiro. So that's kind of what Torres is like if you want to visualize his style. So that's a bit of a problem for Duncan, because Duncan's quite flat-footed, more of a volume striker, doesn't have much power in his hands. It's just a very flat, basic, average striker. So Torres is a significantly better striker than Duncan. Now, I said that Duncan wasn't that dangerous in my Discord community earlier on in the week. And Parlon's piped up and he was like, how can you say that? Look at all his knockouts. He's got tons of knockouts. But, again, like I always say, what happens with a lot of guys is when they're fighting these lower level opponents outside of the UFC, they get loads of knockouts, loads of submissions, loads of finishes because they're facing lower level guys. As soon as they start to face a step up in competition, that's when you get to see how dangerous they really are. And we can see it with Duncan. Outside of the UFC, tons of knockouts. As soon as he comes to the UFC, well, he fought to a decision just before coming to the UFC and then has gone to a decision in his 2 UFC fights. So now that Duncan is starting to face a step up in competition, we're seeing what he's actually capable of. And to me, he doesn't look dangerous at all on the feet. Doesn't really have any power in his hands, more of a volume striker. So if this fight stays standing, Torres should do pretty well, so long as he's got the cardio to obviously perform well over 3 rounds and perform over 3 rounds like he does in 1 round. Now, in terms of grappling, total unknown. And anyone that says any different are kidding themselves. We have 0 footage available on Torres' takedown offense and ground game. There's some footage from a very long time ago on his takedown offense and ground game, but it doesn't tell us anything about where he's at today in 2024. So when you look at Chris Duncan, even though Duncan is primarily a striker, we did see him using grappling in his fight against Omar Morales. So if Duncan were to come into this fight with a grappling heavy game plan, and if Torres is one of these guys that has got no takedown offense and no ground game, Duncan could absolutely dominate him. And there's just no way to know if that's possible. We know Duncan grapples at times, and because we don't know anything about Torres' takedown offense and ground game, we don't know how much success Duncan could potentially have with a grappling heavy game plan. This guy might have the best takedown offense in the history of the UFC, might have the best cardio in the history of the UFC, stuff every takedown, dominate Duncan on the feet. He also might have no cardio, no takedown offense, no grappling, and Duncan may come out absolutely dominate him. Could go either way. I've got no fucking clue what happens in this fight. We need more footage. And this is an address. I'm going to start asking for this very politely and nicely. Mr. Dana White. Mr. Dana White. Been watching the UFC for 20 years. No disrespect. No disrespect, because I've been able to build a business and a career off your business, which I'm very grateful for. But you have to stop giving guys like Manuel Torres contracts. Please, stop it. It's not fun. You need to stop it. Yes, he's fun. Yes, he's exciting. Yes, he's very dangerous and flashy and all that stuff. But it's kind of insane how often I have to research fighters now where they are getting contracts in the UFC and we literally know absolutely nothing about them. And this wasn't a thing until COVID hit. Before COVID, every time someone fought in the UFC, you'd know a lot about them because you actually had to prove yourself before you got into the UFC. Now, anyone with a pulse and a few knockout wins can get a contract. I don't understand a guy who has only been to a decision 1 time and has fought a really low-level opponent can get a contract in the Super Bowl of mixed martial arts. I just don't get it. I don't get it. I know he's got 2 knockout wins in the UFC, 1 on the Contender Series, but he should never have got onto the Contender Series because he's completely unproven. Can we start giving guys contracts who are proven? Guys who, you know, have got some experience, you know, outside of the UFC. Because, you know, you could get fucking, like, Manuel Torres could be amazing, right? But what happens is they toss contracts out to anybody these days, and that's how you end up with guys like Darius Flowers in the UFC. Like, no disrespect to Darius Flowers, but it's just like, Dana, man, where did it all go wrong? When did standards slip so much? This is supposed to be the Super Bowl of mixed martial arts. Like I say, Torres might be amazing, but if you're an NFL team, you don't fucking drive past a bunch of guys playing, football in the park and hand them a contract to play in the NFL. Like, what are we doing here? That's essentially what the UFC are doing when they give contracts to guys like Darius Flowers, Manuel Torres, who we don't know anything about. Literally don't know anything about. Because anyone can look like a world champion against low-level opponents. Anyone can knock guys out who, are just not fighters at the end of the day. It's time that the UFC started remembering what got them to the dance in the first place. Great fights, high-level matchups, the Super Bowl of mixed martial arts. To quote Dana White, where is that vision gone? How do we get to this point where guys who are completely unproven are now in the UFC, and lots of them every weekend? It's fucking annoying. For a guy like me that relies a lot on fight research to bet fights, I'm like, what are we doing over here, man? What are we doing? Gone are the days when you actually have to prove yourself to get into the Super Bowl of mixed martial arts. It's wild. But enough moaning. Let's get into the over-under on this one. So I wouldn't touch the over-under on this one because we don't know anything about Torres. In fact, I wouldn't touch the props either because we don't know anything about Torres. This fight dead for betting. Avoid, 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 avoid. Best case scenario is this fight goes deep. This fight goes to a decision. We see Torres tested in lots of different areas. Then we'll know more about him to bet him next time that he fights. Please, Dana, give us more meaningful matchups. Ones like this are just dead for betting. We don't know anything about Torres, man. So I hope you found that useful. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you crush it this weekend. I hope you make loads of money. And I hope you found these breakdown videos useful. If you did, please hit the like button below. Helps pump the video to more people, which will help my channel grow. What else will help my channel grow is if you could subscribe to me. I'd really appreciate that. It makes me motivated to keep pumping these videos out. So thank you very much. Have a great week and a great weekend. There's tough times out there in the world right now, boys. It's really tough. So I hope you're going to do okay this week. I hope you're going to have a happy week and a good week. If you don't, hopefully next week will be better for you. Take care, everyone. Love you all. Nice one, guys. I'll speak to you again soon. Bye.